Mine is going to depart severally from what we have had this morning, and also a good part of the first presentation, which is if you are looking for the hard evidence of what is going to help in reducing violence by 50% over the next 30 years. This is at best a work in progress. Actually, the language we use is good practice. We are not even there at best practice. We don't use best practice, we use good practice. The picture you have there is one of several mass grave sites in the central and northern part of Nigeria, where people have been killed in mass numbers as a result of identity-based violence. Now, scholarly interest and attention have essentially focused a lot on the sources, the risk factors, and the triggers, but hardly do you have extensive focus, except for the reports of human rights organizations, looking at what state institutions, especially the security forces, do that often lead to increasing rather than reducing violence. That's what, and then some emerging approaches that could be evaluated with a view to seeing what is in there that can be scaled up if we look at reducing violence by 50% over the next 30 years. Well, we'll start with the context. One is historically, our region is known for violence linked to identity. The 15 countries that make up West Africa have all gone through cycles of military coups, civil wars, and violent conflict, leading to millions of life lost. Actually, how I got my name, Innocent, was one of those conflicts. I was born in 1966 when people from my part of the country were, almost annihilated. Those days, they weren't using genocide; they used pogrom. So my mother was pregnant with me and named me Innocent because I didn't choose to be born around that time for all the troubles she has gone through. But it will appear that violence has actually increased over the past 20 to 25 years of end of the Cold War. A lot of people argue, a lot of scholars say under the Cold War, African dictators drew support from the major allies to hold their population. So issues around identity were frozen. But with the end of the Cold War and shift in global dynamics, where the talk about good governance became what was privilege, the link that held them sort of gave way. So an unstoppable transition process emerged. A lot of some countries passed through the transition and established thriving democracies, like in Ghana, in Benin Republic, and in Senegal. Others didn't quite succeed, and we had this rush of civil wars in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea, and in Nigeria we have been frozen in what you might describe as a gray zone of politics that is neither democratic nor outrightly authoritarian, but a lot of people are dying. But the good news is that in the last 10 years, West Africa has achieved a lot of progress on several fronts. Democracy is now the preferred system of government, however flawed it is. ECOWAS actually has a protocol that automatically suspends a country where democratic system of governance was withdrawn. Our economy is growing at a level of 5% thanks to rising commodity prices and, of course, the service sector, the banking, the telecom, and all that. But in spite of all these progress, identity-based violence, especially in the form of ethnic attacks, religious violence, gender violence, sexual orientation-based attacks persist. And what has not been focused on, as I said earlier, is the role of security forces in this violence. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus a little more on what improving their accountability can actually do in reducing violence. And I will pay particular attention to ethno-religious and communal violence in Nigeria. So we'll look at the extent and drivers of this violence, security interventions and their impact, emerging good practices from West Africa, and of course draw a conclusion on the tension. If you look at the map of Nigeria, in terms of violence, you will not see a green area. There is no part of the country where you don't have one form of identity-based attacks or the other. But if these pictures were clearer, in my Apple it was quite clear. You will see Borno State at the extreme northeast end. Around the two states surrounding it is Yobe and Adamawa. And then if you come to the center, you see Plateau State and Kaduna State that have become the epicenter of ethno-religious violence in Nigeria. In terms of numbers, there are a lot of organizations tracking it. In the last 4 years of Jonathan government, we have actually witnessed about over 23,000 cases of people who have died violently as a result of these violence. But what will interest you is that the state has actually killed more than 50% of those people than people involved in sectoral violence. So if you are thinking of reducing violence, if the state can reduce the ones it's involved in, maybe we will have we've gone a long way in reducing violence. Focusing on ethno-religious violence, in the last 15 years of elected civilian government, we've again seen over 8,000 people, largely located within these two states, Plateau State and Kaduna State. On underlying factors, a lot of people have talked about poverty, inequality, and unemployment. But it's not straightforward. It's actually the identity of those who are trapped in this and the identity of those who are on the other side that triggers, because poverty, inequality, and unemployment in Nigeria actually has a geography. It has an identity. And it leads to people who are caught on the other side to know who their targets are when they have opportunities for that. The citizenship question is also a key factor. We have a situation where merely carrying Nigerian passport doesn't guarantee you much. A lot of services, a lot of rights of citizens come from your state of origin. And we have what we call indigenship and settler syndrome, where people who are born in a state, regardless of how long, decades, centuries, their parents and grandparents have lived in that state, but because they cannot trace their ancestry to that state, they are denied a lot of things. And it does breed resentment that often lead to violence. One is rising youth demography and alienation. Depending on which statistics you refer, over 50% of the Nigerian population is made up of people who are under 30. Some raise it up to 70%. And these people, the statistics show that over 60% of them are unemployed. And because of that, cut off from the mainstream society and means of self-actualization. Then, of course, you have manipulation by the political elites that use differences, especially during political period, election period, which is why the 15 years of elections and elected government in Nigeria have seen an increase rather than a reduction in identity-based violence, especially ethno-religious subset. And finally is impunity. It's unbelievable that people who have been involved in killing others in mass numbers, you can count on your fingers how many of them have been brought to book. And as a result of these, communities are broken. So informal mechanisms for inter-communal relationship have broken down, giving way to suspicion. Any slight misunderstanding leads to taking each other's life. We look at security intervention and their impact. The pictures you see there are a group of Muslims praying in the north in Plateau State. In the center is an armored personnel carrier. This is the typical arrest when you have a violence. People are stripped to bare pants just to get them arrested. And the typical strategies are mass arrests. You will think that when violence happens, security forces will be painstaking in who they arrest with a view to gathering the evidence to put them to prosecution. But no, the whole idea of arresting people is to let the matter lie down. Let people think that something is being done. But as soon as the violence is over, the people are quietly let out because there is no evidence to actually put them to trial. We have excessive use of force, community punishment. If somebody from a particular ethnic group, religious group is involved in one thing or the other, especially if there's altercation with the security forces, when they want to intervene, every member of that community is guilty of that. So we have military invasion, we have police invasion, and what that does, it breeds resentment. And when people have the opportunity to revenge, they take it on whoever they think brought the security. You have lack of evidence. There's actually no interest in gathering evidence and prosecution because of the suspicion, talking about criminal justice system being broken. Police do not believe that the courts are interested in finding anybody guilty. They believe that on flimsy technical grounds, people are let off the hook. But the court, in their part, say, without evidence, how can we put somebody to trial? So the criminal justice system also plays a role, the lack of confidence and trust in it. And then you have issues around political interference, preference for political solution. When you have a major outbreak, the interest of political leaders is, oh, let's create local government for them, let's create chiefdom. But the issue of bringing perpetrators to justice is not paid attention to. And whenever people have opportunity, because those who attack their parents, their brothers, their sisters are seen walking in the streets, they take the laws into their own hand. And then you have no clear procedure for interagency collaboration and coordination in responding to ethno-religious violence, because there is rivalry between the police and the military. And when the military want to intervene, they want the police to totally hand over the scene to them so that they can do whatever they like, and police are reluctant. So because of this rivalry, you often have delay in having security forces intervene. And that's why whoever you speak to will tell you they don't intervene on time, and when they do, it's taking excessive force that further aggravates grievances. Now we look at emerging good practices. As I say, these are work in progress, but a number of countries are actually showing the way, and it will show you a link between stable democracy and reduction. Because often, as he said earlier, we try to remove the stability of the state and the system of government from what leads to violence and how to reduce it. In Ghana, that has had over 2 decades of periodic elections, and the reform within their intelligence and security services had led to decentralization of security agencies by creating committees at local level with participation of the local people. And one of these is what they call district security committees. It's not as if they don't have ethno-religious violence, but because of the presence of committees like this, they are able to deal with it. So it is what they're looking at with a view to seeing whether it's something that can be replicated. Because people feel that when they are alienated, they don't know how security forces operate, they are not consulted, there is not much they can do when situations break down. There's also need for development of clear jurisdictions and protocols for collaboration. And this is an area where the Francophone countries are actually leading. Because in the Anglophone, you don't have a stop-gap agency between the regular police and the military. But in the Francophone countries, you have gendarmeries that are in between, and they have their clear functions. So before the military, before troops are called in, the gendarmerie must have intervened, and they have protocols on when to intervene and how to intervene, which you don't often find in the Anglophone countries in West Africa. So any situation that overwhelms the police, the military are immediately called in. And what the military know how best to do is to finish the opponents that are fighting them. So the whole issue of having a clear jurisdiction and protocol is very important. There's also the need of involvement of civil society groups in this. There is an experiment going on in Lagos with the involvement of Clean Foundation, DFID, and some other donors, facilitating what they call local accountability forum. Is something like, how best to describe it is a coordinated governance approach where security and accountability are not left to the security forces alone, but the community members are involved, the local authorities are involved, and of course the security agencies, and they meet on a periodic and predictable basis so that anybody who have information about situations that can threaten law and order, or when people feel that they are wrongly targeted by the police, they have platforms that they can report to rather than take the laws into their hands. How am I doing for time?
3 minutes?
3 minutes, yeah. I'm almost there. Another one is prosecution of our perpetrators. I told you earlier that you hardly find cases where people are brought to book. And why is that the case? Nigeria is a federation. Things like culpable homicide and arson are state-level offenses. They are supposed to be dealt with by the state. But when you have states that are interested in this, that is often the case, where those in government have an interest or supporting one side, it's difficult to use their own agencies to actually prosecute anybody. But in this particular case of a violence in 2010, where over 2,000 people were killed, the Federal Attorney General took over the case, hired private lawyers who prosecuted them, and over 75 people were sentenced to prison between 5 and 15 years. And why they use private prosecutors is that whenever you have violence pitching one community and another, and they are taken to court, every member of their community contributes to hire the best lawyers in town, whereas state councils are, junior lawyers or people who are, trying to get some experience before they launch out to set up their own practice, and they often falter when the cases are brought to court. But in this particular case, where you have private senior lawyers involved, it did lead to another important good practice is at the ECOWAS level. There are frameworks now in place for security sector governance. Many of them have not fully come on stream, but the realization in the region is that unless they bond together to confront this issue, because every country has the same challenge in one level or at one level or the other, but by bonding together, creating frameworks for improving security accountability, they stand a chance of making progress. So in conclusion, I will say, unlike what we had this morning, that violence is reducing from the region where I come, especially when you're looking at identity-based violence, is actually on the rise. And state commitment is very, very important in dealing with it, because it's only when you have an accountable government that security forces can in turn be accountable. Thirdly, working with civil society is important to expand their roles beyond mere monitoring and reporting to actually facilitating models of good practice in security accountability, which is what groups like CLEAN are doing. Then there's a need to work with international agencies, especially World Health Organization, to document what has worked and disseminate it. Because of limited resources, you can hardly have people prioritizing rigorous measurement to establish the evidence base when you have real cases to respond to. But if we have international agencies that support this kind of work, it will help a lot. And finally is investment in generation of quality data. You can't talk about reduction of violence by 50% when you don't have a baseline. So establishing a baseline and making sure that every donor-supported reform project is monitored and evaluated with a view to identifying what has worked and communicating it globally. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.